Hey, John.
Hey, George, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. I was just thinking of you the other night.
Hmm.
Uh, I went to a really interesting event organized by the Blogging Heads overseer Bob Wright
Oh,
in New York. He's spending the next year as the I don't know what it's called, scholar in residence at the Union Theological Seminary,
hmm.
right north of Columbia University, and he's organizing all these events.
Wow.
And he had one just a few days ago called Evolution and Original Sin.
Hmm.
And so, doesn't that sound like such a Bob
It does. It does. So what was
topic?
the original sin in that context?
Well, the actual original sin as postulated by some versions of Christianity. So
Oh, the snake, the apple, the taste from the tree of the fruit from the tree of knowledge.
yeah, that
Yeah.
there's something that there's something that all of us, as soon as we're born, are guilty of, and that dates back to Adam and Eve. So the gist of the event was to compare and contrast religious versions of original sin with what evolutionary theory, evolutionary psychology, more specifically, says about the origins of human badness.
Oh, okay.
Because evolutionary psychology also suggests that we're born with certain mean, selfish tendencies
Hmm.
and tendency to be aggressive and maybe even violent in certain
Yeah.
circumstances.
Things that
And
have a
so,
fitness advantage
yeah,
in theory.
and so this is something that Bob has written about throughout his career in The
Yeah.
Moral Animal and elsewhere. And so Bob was the moderator, and then he had this wonderful professor of psychology from Yale named Paul Bloom,
Oh,
who's
Paul Bloom.
yeah, he's a Blogging Heads regular actually, and he wrote a book called the title is, I think it's Just Babies: The Origin of Good and Evil.
Hmm.
And it's about, because he specializes in developmental psychology, the psychology of infants and young children, and the evolving moral sense and so forth. So that's what this book, Just Babies, was about. And just is a pun there. It also means not only
Oh,
babies, but
just.
yeah, so babies with a sense of fairness.
Oh, okay.
And then there are these two theologians, one the president of the Union Theological Seminary, and another one a professor there, who were both who've done a lot of thinking about original sin and could
Hmm.
explicate the evolution of thinking about original sin in Christian
Huh.
theology, and how it compared with some of these ideas that were coming from evolutionary psychology. And the reason that I thought of you was
Yeah,
that,
I hesitate
with
to
the whole,
ask.
yeah, well, the whole premise was that there are really deep analogies, perhaps, between religion's view of the world and of humanity
Ah,
and sciences.
okay.
And it reminded me of your wonderful 20-year-old book, Fire in the Mind.
Ah, thank you.
How about that for a segue?
I like that. I like that. And it's amazing that, well, we both had the same experience of having books we wrote at almost exactly the same time come out in 20th anniversary editions.
Yeah, and what's cool about it is that when they came out 20 years ago, I immediately recognized. I got your book in galleys and was asked to write a review of it for the Sciences,
Yeah,
this magazine that doesn't exist anymore.
it's a
Where
great
Bob
name.
Wright also got his start.
That's right.
And,
I forgot that.
yeah, and this goes back. I think he started there in the 80s, and you and I ended up. Your book. There was a lot in it that I agreed with, but there was one really pretty profound area of disagreement
Yeah.
between the two of us that I think has persisted. And I actually worried that your book was so persuasive that it was going to change my mind about the premise of the end of science. And so I wrote my review of your book basically as an attempt to convince myself that I was right and you were wrong.
Yeah, it's a great review.
It was a real struggle.
Yeah, I think I quoted that, or they quoted it, on the very first page of the paperback. Mm-hmm. Yeah, here, I guess I get to hold this up, right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so it actually looks exactly the same as the non-20th anniversary edition, except it says on the cover, with a new preface marking the 20th anniversary. And then I have this new preface, which is actually this very short thing, just kind of updating it and putting it into the context of 2015.
Yeah, I just read that, and I also had a premise. I think I had to work a little harder on my premise because, my thesis, of course, was that all the really cool stuff in science that can be discovered has been discovered, and so then I had to try to disparage things that have happened in the last 20 years. So
I didn't have nearly that much to. I mean, the main thing I had to do was to mention that when I wrote the book, they hadn't discovered / invented dark energy, and note that superstrings are still as far off from acceptance or empirical validation than they were when I wrote the book 20 years ago. Things like that, plus the Indian casino north of Santa Fe. It was an Indian bingo parlor back then, and I used it in a chapter to talk about the nature of randomness, and that's now a full-blown casino. So I kind of used that as a way to bring the book up into the current year.
Does it still have the big, what is it, a camel or something?
The camel, yes. It's Camel Rock. And it's called Camel Rock Casino now. And there's a stone formation of the camel that looks across the highway. And I kind of use that as a device and talk about the riddle of the camel and, when is the order we see really there and when are we projecting it with our own minds and seeing patterns in randomness, and when do we know whether it's really randomness or if it's just complexity too deep to fathom?
Yeah, this issue never goes away. It's something that I constantly think about. And I have colleagues who are constantly challenging my view of science, which is that in certain cases we really get things right, and that science does reflect reality in some really significant way.
I don't disagree with that.
Well, maybe we can figure out where we do disagree, because to me, this is certainly one of the most interesting issues in modern philosophy, the question to which science.
It's an issue that'll never be settled because, for reasons I get into in the book, we're finite beings in an infinite universe, and we can't step outside of the universe and get a God's eye view and see it whole. So there's always going to be this core uncertainty in this edge beyond which the brain cannot penetrate.
But so here's the question. I agree with you that when you get to the borders of scientific knowledge, and especially when you're talking about things like string theory, which string theory is, I would say, even further from any kind of empirical validation today than it was 20 years ago. It's we can talk about talk about that.
But huge numbers of different string theories, each for a different huge number of universes.
Right. Which neither the strings nor the other universes can ever be. This is a statement that some people might disagree with, but I think they can never be.
If there ever was an edge, that's it.
But the question I have is the degree to which some of the foundations of physics.
Yeah.
We would call them foundations now. We can accept as true without any scare quotes around true. So, that all matter is constructed of these things that we call atoms, which in turn are constructed of constituent particles called neutrons and protons and electrons, and the neutrons and protons are constructed of quarks and
but
yeah. Okay, so that's the but is what.
Yeah. Well, when you describe that, I mean, the picture this generates in someone's mind is basically, building blocks or these hardcore little particles. Here's the atom, just like the models they have, or at least they used to have in high school science classes, and in the little solar system with the hard little electrons spinning around the nucleus, and then the protons like pop apart into three quarks, and then of course when you really start reading about this stuff, you see the particles are actually waves, except when they're not, and you have the quantum uncertainty, and you have the quarks that are permanently bound by the strong nuclear force inside the nucleons, the protons and the neutrons, so they can't ever come out and be observed. You have the electrons that are surrounded by basically infinite clouds of virtual particles that are being exchanged, and it's a very it's very, very abstract and very esoteric compared to the building block model, which is just the simplification that our brains have imposed on this incredible, deep, fathomless complexity, and it allows us to do and predict some amazing things. So in that sense, we certainly have a nice angle on subatomic reality. And it's tested, in experiments again and again. But to say that that's actually really what's going on in there, I think, that's a leap. And even though I have no idea what it would look like, I'm still fascinated by the possibility that some civilization in another part of the universe has evolved and parsed what's going on subatomically, or whatever they call it in their language, using different concepts, and that these different concepts would at first seem, even, after you translate the two intergalactic languages, even after you translated them, that they would, seem really just completely bizarre and like a whole different universe to us. And yet, if we dug deeper, we would find that one was mappable onto the other. They were equivalent ways of carving up the universe from two different perspectives. And, maybe having two different perspectives gives you closer to, the real thing that's going on in there. But, I mean, that's the best we can ever do. And it's a huge amount. And it's, amazing that we can do that. But so I guess it's a subtle distinction. I was glad to see you reposted that review in your blog today.
Yeah,
and you used in the headline and in the introduction the word postmodern.
Right.
And
are you okay with that term?
Oh no, I just thought it was interesting because I don't think the word postmodern appears anywhere in my book.
Yeah,
so that's interesting to me, but that doesn't mean that that's not what it's about. So
most postmodernists don't like to be called postmodern. The only person I know who embraces the term postmodernism or postmodernist is this wonderful colleague I have at Stevens Institute named Jim McClellan. He's an historian of science. He studied under Thomas Kuhn in the 1970s. At Princeton when Kuhn was already becoming a pretty big deal. This was more than a decade after The Structure of Scientific Revolutions was published. And McClellan just thinks I'm a ridiculously naive realist, that I believe that science converges on truth. He thinks that the convergence model is profoundly flawed. He likes to call our scientific accounts of reality stories. And some stories are better than others, that's for
Yeah,
sure. And
yeah,
some yield all sorts of powerful applications and
yeah.
allow us to control the world. But his view is very similar to yours, and in that it emphasizes the the social aspects, the culturally conditioned, and then you would have to say contingent aspects of our understanding
Yeah, I'd say
of
contingent.
nature.
I don't know about culturally determined. I don't think I don't go there. It's the to me what it comes down to is that basically we have these brains. I'm sure I've said this in different ways before on this very very show, but we have these brains that evolved, in this little corner of the universe, the third rock from this particular star in the Milky Way, among the billions of stars and the billions of galaxies, et cetera, et cetera. And our brains evolved for the purpose of survival, to
Right.
find things to eat and to keep from being eaten. And to think that through these filters, neural network by which we perceive the world, that we can confidently say what's going on in the deepest levels of the subatomic universe or the farthest reaches of the macro universe, and to say that the Big Bang happened not 13 billion years ago, but 13.8 with this kind of precision.
Right.
I mean, obviously, it's wonderful that science can make their very best arguments using our blinkered senses to come up with numbers like this, and I'm sure there's some truth in it, but it's a perspective, and it's contingent on the limitations of our brains. So,
Paul Bloom, this Yale psychologist who was at this event that Bob Wright organized this week, had a wonderful defense of science against postmodernism, which arose, or let's just say skepticism,
yeah.
or sort of a healthy, sophisticated skepticism towards science that arose at the meeting. So one of the members of the audience, who I think also was a professor of religion, talked about how science is always culturally conditioned, and that how many of the sort of conceptual underpinnings of science have to be seen as products of particular societies in particular historical eras,
Yeah.
and that then there's a very strong subjective component to all of them. And I could see Bloom sort of squirming, and then he said, "Yeah, so all of that is true, and scientists as individuals have really strong confirmation bias, and we have our pet theories, and we argue for them." For reasons that often are emotional, and we reject alternatives and so forth. He said, but the interesting thing about science is that I'll have my view of a child's mind, and I throw it out there, and here this guy, Bob Wright, or some other psychologist comes up with all these reasons why my view is wrong.
Exactly.
And we argue about that. And socially, through all this conflict and argumentation within science, sometimes we really get things pretty right.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
Like now, the irony is that I think in psychology that actually hasn't happened.
Well, no, but ideally, in the long run, that's how science works. And
right.
see, I don't disagree with that at all. And that's the whole thing about. I mean, I've written a lot of things in which I really come down on the whole idea of scientific truth being culturally determined. And like when I was writing about the telescope protesters in Hawaii and the young anthropologists who were casting science as an arm of a means of manufacturing knowledge like any other product as part of the hegemonic agenda of Western colonialism. I mean, to me, that stuff is just, vapid. It's just vapid.
Here's the funny thing. I actually think that there is a lot of truth to that view of science as a projection of powerful institutions.
It's an interpretation that you can, along with all the I find postmodernism absolutely fascinating, and am really intrigued by the idea that everything is basically texts commenting on texts, because
Right.
it all comes down to language, everything that we understand and agree and disagree with. But still, I guess what keeps me from thinking of what I'm writing as being postmodernist is, to me, a postmodernist would say, the old story of the what is it, 9 blind men and the elephant?
Right.
Like the postmodernists would say there's only blind men and no elephant.
Right.
I would say that there is an elephant, but that each of the 9 blind men probably only has varying approximations of what the elephant is or is like.
Right. Let me just ask you, what do you think of Thomas Kuhn at this point? Because
really?
I found your view of science to be very Kuhnian. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah, to the extent that Kuhn himself is Kuhnian. I mean, that's a whole other debate, right? Because, people take Kuhn as, in the most extreme postmodern interpretation of saying there's only blind men and no elephants. But
right.
I don't think Kuhn thought that at all. I mean, he's basically saying that we have a bunch of blind men and women working together, coming up with a scientific consensus. The consensus gets locked in, and it's true. Once a consensus becomes a consensus, people tend to see things through that lens, and
right.
and anything that seems to challenge the consensus is going to be absorbed kind of amoeba-like into the consensus itself as, the so-called exception that proves the rule, or an auxiliary hypothesis will be added so that it all fits into the current consensus, until so many of these little disturbances, build up that suddenly in the relativity of time, suddenly it all collapses, and then it's reconfigured in a new way that probably incorporates the old consensus, but, like going from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics. But that's not saying that this isn't all about something that's really out there.
Right. Well, see, Kuhn was one of the most fascinating scientific figures I ever met, and I felt that he was horrified at how certain people who would identify as postmodernists interpreted his work in a way that he felt was almost anti-scientific and too disparaging.
Yeah.
But some of the comments that he made about science, I thought, really came very close to radical postmodernism.
Yeah.
And here's one area of convergence with how you talked about science in your book, that he compared the evolution of science or progress in science, and he would put scare quotes around progress, at least in some of his writings. He compared it to the evolution of life. Mm-hmm. And he said that it's prohibited to think of the evolution of life as having any kind of goal. It wasn't progressing toward humanity. Yeah. And all we can say is that life now is different than it was before. And Gould and Kuhn would say in the same way that you can't say that science is evolving toward truth. That science is just different than it was 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, or even in the time of Plato and Aristotle. And if you remember, the epiphany that led to the structure of scientific revolutions came from Kuhn pondering how somebody as smart as Aristotle could have had such silly ideas as were laid out in his physics. Yeah. And then Kuhn just said, it's not that Aristotle was wrong. Yeah. His ideas were just different than ours are today.
I mean, part of me would agree with that. I mean, Ptolemaic astronomy, with the Earth in the center of the universe and everything revolving around it, works wonderfully well in making calculations. And it's basically what every sailor, out in the sea uses to find their position, or at least it was before GPS. You assume this fiction that the Earth is in the middle, and everything goes around it, and you can do these calculations. So in that sense, it's as good a system as the very first versions of the heliocentric system, with the sun in the center of the solar system, were much more cumbersome, and they had as many epicycles as Ptolemy's universe, Copernicus's and Galileo's, until Kepler basically comes up with, hey, maybe it's ellipses instead of circles, these orbits, and then it all became much neater, but you could still construct the whole astronomy, by keeping with the Ptolemaic view, and then you'd have to invent some kind of force probably that would explain what's keeping all of these stars and galaxies revolving around the little old Earth. So maybe you'd have to come up with a whole new physics to do this, and you would have to, or maybe you wouldn't have forces and energy, and you'd have some entirely different conception, and it would become incredibly cumbersome. And then someone would step in at some point saying, hey, look, what if we rejigger it like this with, the heliocentric view and epicycles, and hey, gravity, and then it would seem like a better system, and therefore progress.
Right. Well, but do you? I brought up this term convergence.
Yeah.
So if you chart the progress of science, you've got on the right axis, absolute truth.
Yeah.
And you've got. And so there's a curve of science, and maybe it's kind of wiggling a little bit, or certainly it's got some. It's not a slow incremental curve, because there are these revolutionary periods.
Yeah.
This is what Kuhn was so interested in.
Yeah, it's like punctuated equilibrium.
Yes, exactly. Where there's a sudden change. But do you see that curve is getting? Maybe it doesn't reach that right axis, but it gets closer and closer to it?
Yeah. It asymptotically approaches some ideal truth, but asymptotically in that it never actually reaches it. So, and it doesn't, and maybe it's not steady, but it's more, then it'll jag back and forth, but then, with all the zigs and zags, I think it's moving toward better and better approximations, and in that sense, I think it's an endless process. So there's where we probably disagree. The end of science and endless science, and that was kind of my take at the time of the core difference between Fire in the Mind and the end of science. Right.
Well, even there, we could find agreement, because I do think there's going to be an incremental. I don't. My claim is that you won't. In some of these fields, you're not going to have great paradigm shifts in the future, because basically we've got things right to the extent that we can get them right.
Yeah.
And you're still going to have, maybe it's going to be 13.87 billion years for the age of the universe in the future. Or
it's going to be 15 or 20
yes.
or 50 or 7. But, those to me would be trivial minor adjustments, compared to just having, this, the picture of the Big Bang is just so powerful, and there's no real alternative.
Let me ask you this. This is something that I mentioned in my review, and it's funny because I didn't realize I was thinking of it this way back then. This is a question that I pose to my students all the time. Do you think that our descendants, let's say, 500 years, 1,000 years from now, will look at our scientific picture of the world and see it as being as primitive as the science, quote unquote, of Aristotle appears to us?
Well, but we look back at Newton in the 17th century with great awe and admiration, and Laplace and Lagrange, and to me, it just amazes me that, wow, how could people in the 1600s, be so smart,
right,
and far smarter than I am, and to come up with these amazing explanations, and especially considering the limitations of their tools.
Yeah.
to me, that's just, mind-blowing. Or the people as long ago as when Aristotle lived were talking about ideas and the nature of reality and weren't just, fighting each other over, where the next meal would come from. I mean, to me, I think that's, really, really rather awesome in the real dictionary sense of the word.
That's yes, definitely. So you want to respect the questions they were asking, and rather than maybe disparaging the answers that they arrived at.
Well, like with the Aristotelian physics, where the body in motion, stays in motion because that's its nature, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems obviously true from observing the world around you until you start observing a little more closely, and like if you slide a rock across a smooth expanse of ice, it seems to just keep going until it hits something. But of course, actually, it's being slowed by friction, and actually, it has this basic inertia that's overcome with the initial force. So you start parsing it up, more finely and more subtly, and you see that Aristotle was wrong. But you can see, why someone would think that, and you can certainly see why someone would believe what appears to be obvious, that the sun, circles the earth, that it comes up every morning and goes around, and then, we see the stars at night obviously circling around the earth. And obviously that's what's going on until you start really getting into it more deeper and then see, but let's shift the perspective here. And, just like what Galileo did in his dialogue of the two great world systems, and shows how it explains so much more with so much less ad hocery and mysticism.
Right. Because I've taught that book by Galileo, so I'm sure you know. I'm sure you know this, but and actually, I was told this by James McClellan, who wrote this wonderful textbook on the history of science and technology that I used when I taught this course. And he pointed out that I think there are three characters, right?
Yes, right.
There's a character who's a stand-in for Galileo himself, and then there's a character who's standing up for the geocentric view of the world, and then there's a neutral bystander who's going, that's a good point, and your point is good too. And I think the guy who is standing up for geocentrism, his name was Simplicio,
right.
Which sort of means dumbass.
Simple. He was the simple, naive person, just asking the wide-eyed questions. And
but the problem was that I think this is toward the end of the book that Simplicio, if you pronounce it that way, that he said some things that the Pope at the time had said to Galileo. He said so Galileo had asked permission to write this book,
right?
And the Pope had said, you can, but just make it clear that ultimately God decides everything, and these are just the human theories, and so Galileo basically repeated through Simplicio what the Pope had said, and the Pope actually was a pretty smart guy, and he realized that Galileo was mocking him in this piece.
Yeah, Galileo was angling for. There have been some interesting books that have taken up that view, and I actually wrote something about this a long time ago, and I'll try to dig it out and link to it. But what really struck me is that the church with Galileo was basically making a postmodern argument.
Right.
They were saying, wow, this heliocentrism, really is really this cool, interesting thing, and it's to the great glory of humankind that the brain can come up with something so wonderful, just like it's, so wonderful that Ptolemy came up with his view of astronomy. And these both are just theories. So as long as you talk about heliocentrism as just a theory, then we're okay with that. And then, because who ultimately knows what's going on out there except God? And
Yeah.
to me, that was a very, very sophisticated view. And there's some authors who've basically, their point of view is that Galileo was just kind of, was really baiting the Pope and cruising for a bruising, as we used to say.
Well,
and Arthur Kessler, I think, was the first person I know of to make that view of Galileo in his book, The Sleepwalkers, which is just wonderful. And his hero was Kepler, and definitely not Galileo. And Galileo,
right.
in his view, was very resistant to Kepler's ideas of ellipses, saying, no, it's got to be circles. So he was, falling back on a kind of mystical view that everything has to be circular.
The idea of the circle as the perfect geometric form was very powerful, even for the rebel Galileo. I had thought that Galileo, he was so arrogant that he actually think that the Pope wouldn't notice that he was being made fun of. But who the hell knows? Maybe he really was sort of on some level hoping for a contradiction.
Yeah, I know.
Let me just ask you this. Just going back to this question of convergence, there was a paper written. I can't remember when it came out. I should have the author right off the top of my head, but I can't remember who the author was. This is a paper I think that came out in the 60s or 70s. It was inspired by Kuhn's book, and the title was "Scientific Revolutions Forever?" ? So it was saying, again, you can have a chart showing the progress of science toward truth as a function of time. Is it going to, at some point, just asymptotically just get closer and closer toward that right axis of truth, or are there going to be these discontinuities where suddenly you have some paradigm that had seemed totally secure shattered, as you had in the early 20th century with quantum mechanics and relativity suddenly bursting on the scene, or as you had in biology, obviously, with the introduction of the evolution by natural selection. Although in that case, you didn't really have much of a theoretical framework before Darwin itself. So you see what I mean? Incremental progress versus like big revolutionary, mind-blowing stuff. Let's say within physics.
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, it's impossible to know. I mean, from looking from this end of the telescope, but it seems highly unlikely. But this this new enormous accelerator that's planned in China.
Oh, I haven't heard about that.
I think I have that right. That it's China. That it will dwarf the superconducting super collider if it's actually built. Who knows what could come out of that, and if it would be something, that would cause physicists to go back and say, well, physics beyond the standard model, and basically the standard model was. Worked really well for what it was, but it was like the Newtonian physics compared to this new formulation. If we, inject, particle X or force Z that we've, just found evidence of. I mean, it's just gets my mind stuttering to try to think about it, because who knows what could possibly happen. Maybe an easier thing to think about is having a theory of consciousness.
Yes.
In the brain. I mean, I think your point in the end of science was, this is where, there were certain areas where science will end or has ended because we've come up with the best theory that it's conceivable that we'll come up with.
Right.
And like particle physics would be one, Darwinian evolution would be one. But then with consciousness, physics will come to an end because we'll never get, significantly closer to understanding it than we are now, that it's basically an unsolvable problem, right?
Right.
Okay, so, but, let's say that I mean, you can imagine. I played with this idea in one of my columns that what philosophers, and we've talked about it, what philosophers like David Chalmers talk about, where suppose that consciousness is not some secondary thing that arises from mass energy interacting in space and time, in the form of the brain here on Earth, but that consciousness is actually a thing or an essence in itself that needs to be added to the pantheon of basic concepts along with mass energy and space-time.
Yes, it's one version of that is called, I think it's called integrated information theory.
Oh, yeah, the Tononi?
Yes, Tononi.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
I have read about it so many times, and I always end up feeling stupid because I don't quite get it. But I'm going to a workshop on it next week with David Chalmers and Tononi and some other folks at NYU, and I'm hoping
jealous.
once and for all, because I am reluctant to criticize it when I don't even understand what it is.
Yeah, I met Tononi years ago. God, he's really impressive, smart guy.
Yeah, I think I met him when I interviewed Gerald Edelman, the great immunologist turned neuroscientist.
Yeah, but you didn't like Edelman.
I didn't like him. He was at Rockefeller in the early 90s. That's when I interviewed him, and I found him to be just, somebody who was so arrogant that he was really blind to the flaws in his own worldview. But he had this graduate student that he called Julio, who was helping give me the tour of his lab and showing me this really pretty pathetic robot that supposedly demonstrated the power of Edelman's theory. Edelman called it his creature. Edelman kept having this way of comparing himself to God. And
I like that line. Edelman has this way of comparing himself to God.
He did it repeatedly. And so Tononi, I think, was just either a graduate student or a postdoc then when I met him and was hanging out with Edelman. And then later, I think, went to Caltech or someplace like that. But anyway, I'm hoping, I'm looking forward to
that'll be fascinating. I think we may have talked about this, but maybe not. But I've become, over the years, more and more impressed with Edelman's theory of neural Darwinism.
Oh, no.
I mean, what really clicked for me was actually recently. When Oliver Sacks died, I went back and read a couple of his books that I'd never read before. And
which ones?
One was Hearing Voices about the deaf and language.
Oh, you mean Oliver Sacks's books, not
Oliver
Edelman.
Sacks's books, and the other one was what's his most famous?
The new memoir.
Awakenings.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
And I think it's in Awakenings where he has, one of his wonderful Oliver Sacks footnotes about Edelman's neural Darwinism. Mm-hmm. And then that made me realize, of course, Edelman and Sacks and there's this other neuroscientist in New York that and they're all part of the New York Review of Books crowd.
Oh yeah,
right. And they would write about each other's ideas in books. But just reading Sacks' description of neural Darwinism, or his critics call it neural Edelmanism, I thought, wow, yes, this makes a lot of sense. But I won't talk about it now. But I just wanted to bring that up, and also just very quickly to interject that it's indeed China that plans the huge super collider, as Elizabeth Gibney reports in Nature.
Oh, that's really exciting. What's supposed to be the completion date?
Let's see. It'll be 27 kilometers. Oh no, that's CERN, of course. It'll be overtaken by the Chinese machine. $3 billion.
Chump change.
Yeah, chump change. It seems. Oh, here we go. 52 kilometers. So.
Okay, I think
underground ring.
SSC was 50 miles, wasn't it?
Oh, I can't remember if this. So this at least gets up toward the ill-fated superconducting super collider. Oh yeah, here there's a great there's a great picture here in the in the Nature article showing the CERN ring, and then the U.S. Europeans proton super collider, China hosted, da da da. Anyway, I shouldn't be researching while I'm talking, but
Right.
we can link to the article here.
I'll check. I'll check that out because I'm glad you brought that to my attention. I
Yeah,
should have
so
been
who
all over
knows?
that.
Maybe this will change everything.
Yeah. But just going back to neuroscience, I think even in the End of Science, and certainly since then, and in the preface, to the new edition of the End of Science, I've said that I think the best hope for huge revolutionary development would be neuroscience,
Mm-hmm.
and especially the solution to what I like to call the neural code. Figuring out what the rules are or the algorithms in our brain that transform physical processes into perceptions and memories and emotions and things like that. I think what I love about this issue is that it raises the question of what would constitute a kind of satisfying theory. When do scientists or the public, when do people decide, yeah, that is really an explanation? Heredity in the late 40s, early 50s, some people were saying maybe it's just too hard. We're not going to figure out how heredity works.
Yeah.
And then the DNA, the double helix was cracked. And then that led to the genetic code within about 10 years. And now heredity is considered a solved problem.
Yeah.
In the same way that photosynthesis is considered to be solved. It's really understood. And the question when it comes to something as kind of personal and meaningful for us as the mind-body problem is whether or not we're ever going to have a theory so compelling that everybody goes, I get it.
Yeah.
That's really a satisfying explanation, because there are aesthetic, subjective elements to this as well. It could be that the mind-body problem, maybe it'll be some version of integrated information theory, but that is, if you look at the details, it will be hideously complex.
Yeah, not something where you just feel it.
Right.
Like when you first learn about the whole Watson-Crick double helix paradigm, and you just go, oh, wow.
It's like a puzzle.
I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or
even the
more
Big Bang, you can go, this makes sense of so many things that we've observed. And, or even, looking at, like I remember reading an Isaac Asimov book when I was in high school probably, or college, and realizing that you could explain things like why rubber is stretchy, for example, or why metal is shiny using chemistry and atomic physics. And you go, wow, these things are really understandable and it makes sense. And I, a non-scientist can read this stuff and get it, get the gist of it. But yeah, it's impossible to imagine what a theory of consciousness would look like, to where you go, oh, right.
That's what John Wheeler, the wonderful physicist, he had this phrase, this saying that he repeated many times, talking about the origin of the universe and the origin of the lawfulness of the origin of this universe with these laws, these forces, these particles, and that he thought at some point it was going to be a revelation where it would be an answer so simple and powerful that we would smack ourselves on the forehead and go, how could we not have seen that before?
Yeah, that's how it's been with all of the really big, great ideas.
Yeah. Evolution, I think, evolution by natural selection, I think is maybe the most powerful, easily understandable explanation that explains so much, right? But some powerful explanations are extraordinarily difficult to get your mind around. So, quantum mechanics, which in some ways is maybe, arguably the greatest insight into nature ever, sort of the physical universe, is, there's still people who devote their careers to figuring out what the hell quantum mechanics
that's true.
means.
There's only a certain level to, that you can really talk about until it just comes down to, to competing interpretations.
Right.
What a physicist friend of mine called the word problem.
Right.
The math is there. It works wonderfully. But how you describe this in terms of our human language, which evolved along with our brains here again on the third rock from the sun. So,
one way I try to approach the mysteriousness of quantum mechanics is to recall that imaginary numbers
mind-blowing?
play a large role. So imaginary numbers are constructed out of the square roots of negative numbers, which by definition actually don't exist.
Yeah.
But if you just assume that there is such a thing as a square root of an imaginary number as an axiom, then you can get all these consequences that you can play with. And it was this totally odd thing that, look at what those wacky mathematicians are coming up with now. And then it turns out actually to be useful for describing quantum stuff.
I mean, what does that mean? Is there something in the in the depths of physical reality that corresponds to imaginary numbers?
And so
it's just mind blowing. Or when you posit extra dimensions, which is not just in superstring theory, like the idea that the proton and the neutron have almost exactly the same mass, but not quite.
Right.
And it's basically the idea is that they're both two faces of something called a nucleon, and if it's rotating one way in something called isospin space, it's a proton, and if it's rotating the other way, it's a neutron. And isospin space is this completely abstract formulation. You can't walk around in isospin space. It's taking certain parameters and putting them on axes and then defining this artificial mathematical space. And then you can simplify protons and neutrons and unify it down into something called a nucleon using this invention called isospin.
Right.
So it's just mind-blowing to me. Yeah.
Charm or color.
Yeah, all of that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff related to quantum electrodynamics, the theory of quarks. And
renormalization of QED, where you have all these things that essentially turn out to be infinite, and then you get the infinities to cancel out. Using these tricks that Feynman came up with. And what does this all mean?
One of the ideas that I came up with in my review of your book, and I'm trying to defend my naive realism against your more skeptical view, is what I call a virtual discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to sort of pound my fist against the table and say, what about galaxies? Those aren't invented. They're out there. You can look through a telescope. What about elements? And the double helix. I can show you an electron microscope image of it, and there it is. And, some people kind of go, although I have met people who say, really smart people, who say that even something like galaxies, 1,000 years from now, we might see our view of galaxies as totally absurd.
That's hard to get my mind around.
It is. But there are some things you can't really, I'm uncomfortable saying even that something like quantum mechanics is discovered, or relativity is discovered, or even, we discovered gravity, but Newton's formula for gravity, was that discovered or invented? It's not in the same category as discovering elements and galaxies and germs and things like that you can actually see.
That's it. Yeah, that's the dilemma.
But
it's a tension, right? It's a tension between invention and discovery.
Well, so I think that some of our inventions, especially mathematical formulations to describe mathematical descriptions of certain phenomena, let's say general relativity as a description of gravity, are so powerful that you can call them virtual discoveries.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But it's getting a little close to Platonism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And because that would be naive, and especially if you look at the invention of some of these mathematical ideas like imaginary numbers, were they waiting out there for us to discover them?
Yeah, right.
And then I start feeling like George Johnson.
Well, yeah, this is what you what you were just saying is just such a perfect description of what I really was struggling with writing Fire in the Mind. Yeah. To what extent are the laws of the universe invented, and to what extent are they discovered? And I think I used the metaphor in the first chapter, like are scientists like miners, mining pre-existing ore, which would be the Platonist view, or are they more like jazz musicians, improvising all this beautiful and yet harmonious to our brains music? And this is kind of something I got into. Did you see I did a piece for my raw data column last month about neutrinos and describing my experience putting on a hard hat with Art McDonald, the guy that just won the Nobel Prize in physics, and going down to the neutrino mine in Sudbury, Ontario, with the nickel miners to go to work.
You're so lucky. I just have to, if I may, a very quick digression.
This is total luck, yeah.
Well, I've been in Sudbury once before. I went there to interview a psychologist named Michael Persinger, who had invented a device called the God Machine.
Oh, I remember what you wrote about that. It's wonderful. The God Machine.
It was a cap that you put on your head, and it would electrically tickle your brain. Wow, and some people claimed that they would have visions of Jesus or Mary or God.
Yeah, transcranial something stimulation.
Right. So Sudbury.
Sudbury. What is it about Sudbury?
No,
I was just amazed because I was, I was reading about the Nobel Prizes and Arthur MacDonald, Sudbury, Canada, and I realized, wait, God, it was long ago.
Yeah.
And I met Art MacDonald. He picked me up at my motel, and we went to a what's the big donut chain in
Krispy Kreme?
No, in Canada.
Dunkin' Donuts?
Oh, no. Okay, I got to find this. God, my memory is just, this is my lead, and here I am. Just whenever I'm put on the spot like this, even when I put myself on the spot. Okay, so the great headline that ran in the newspaper for this was a subatomic existential crisis. And it was, of course, a Tim Hortons. Mm-hmm. So Tim Hortons is very big in Canada. Anyway, my lead was it was 20 years ago that Art MacDonald and I stopped at a Tim Hortons near Sudbury, Ontario for coffee and donuts on our way to his job at the neutrino mine. Donning hard hats, we crowded into a rattling elevator cage and descended 6,800 feet to an underground laboratory that reminded me of one in the Andromeda strain. And then I go on and explain this was the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory, and then MacDonald, I just read that he won a share of a Nobel Prize. And then I go back and describe how I came to Sudbury on what I call the philosophical quest. I wasn't entirely sure I believed in neutrinos, which were invented in 1930 to fill a hole in physics, et cetera, et cetera. And that was originally why I went there. I was doing a piece for the New York Times magazine about this that I had proposed, and I went down there and kind of used the story of the neutrino to frame all these questions about whether science is discovered or whether it's invented. How do we know the neutrino is real? Was it invented or discovered? And, this theory got all the way through, my article got, to the point where, the editor thought it was ready to go, and then it got, some senior editors thought it was too something spooky or esoteric, and ended up taking the kill fee. And something I'm still very bitter about, because I went back and found the article after all of these years. So this was 20 years ago. And just went, well, I think I wrote the article because Fire in the Mind was coming out, and then the article could come out and be keyed to the book. That was part of my motivation. But, a greater part was just that I was fascinated by this. So anyway, the article never ran, and I dug it up. It was still on my desk, and I thought, damn, this is really good. And I didn't reuse any of the language in my column, but I used it to kind of inspire my brain or jostle it to take it in another direction and turn it into an essay about the same kind of stuff in Fire in the Mind.
See, this is the wonderful thing about having a blog, is that if I've got some old thing that never saw the light of day, or even if it did, like with this review of your book, but it's been a really long time. Nobody's even aware that it exists.
Forgotten.
What the hell? I'll post it. And if nobody wants to read it, that's fine.
Yeah,
but,
I don't get to do that, unfortunately. But I did do it when I was briefly doing my, for that 1 year I did a blog for Discover. I did some of that.
Hey, listen, you got to come for the friggin' New York Times. I'm not going to feel sorry for you.
Yeah, no, it's a privilege.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, well, listen, we're almost at an hour.
Oh, how'd we do that? Oh, there's so many things we didn't get to talk about.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I think we covered it. I love this stuff. I think of myself as being an amateur philosopher. I love science, especially when it raises these kinds of philosophical questions. And you clearly are interested in a lot of those same questions. So it's
amateur philosopher. I like that. Me too.
Yeah, which in a way is good, because sometimes if you're too much of a professional, I think it's healthy. Yeah. It's good to have a healthy sense of irony when you talk about philosophy.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't feel like I have any axe to grind. I don't have any particular position that I'm invested in. I just, I'm constantly puzzled by all this stuff and like to write about my puzzlement. I
think good philosophy, and this is what I loved about your book, that it sort of increases, instead of making you think, oh yeah, okay, so that's been solved, I don't have to think about that anymore. It's more a sense of evoking awe and mystery, because that really should be how we view life, because it's weird.
It is weird, yeah. I mean, how did this happen?
Yeah,
this world we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I think no matter how smart we get, no matter how, my prediction is that our sense of puzzlement will grow. Mm-hmm. And the more we know, the more baffled we'll be by how this whole came about.
Unless we're descending into a new dark ages, but that's a subject for another time.
Right. Hey, anyway, so congratulations.
John, thanks so much. And thanks for that great review. It's really my favorite.
It was my favorite review to have written. I'd never written a review as long or as time-consuming. I really had to think about that one.
No, it's just wonderful to be taken, to write a book and have it be taken so seriously as to warrant, like thousands of words of puzzlement.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Thanks so much.
All right, George, I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.